All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're going to be checking out something pretty interesting, a little out there, maybe even a little unsettling.
Okay.
We're taking a look at this sermon from John Brisby called Remember What God Wants.
Interesting.
He delivered it back in June of this year.
Yeah.
Now, Brisby, he's a minister, but he's part of this kind of like offshoot of Armstrongism. It's a movement with its own like very distinct, very controversial view of Christianity.
You know, it's funny. When I was going through this sermon, I felt like I was like stepping into a boardroom with God as this like ultimate CEO.
Okay.
You know, Brisby presents this idea that salvation isn't just this gift of grace. It's like this high stakes job interview.
Yeah.
Where you're constantly having to prove you're worthy to get like this executive position in God's kingdom.
So like no pressure or anything. You forget
Yeah.
fire and brimstone. Now we're talking like the pearly gates are a corporate headquarters.
Right.
And God's up there sizing you up to see if you're, if you get the promotion.
Right.
So like what are the qualifications?
Well, I mean, Brisby's argument is that God isn't just building like a community of believers. He's building like a powerful government.
Okay.
And in this like divinely ordained corporation, there's no room for entry level. I mean, he actually says there are no jobs as like a doorkeeper or a street sweeper.
Wow.
It's kings and priests only in God's kingdom.
Forget sweeping floors in heaven. It's straight to the executive suite. I mean,
Yeah.
that is a very different image of heaven than a lot of Christians hold, right? It's almost like Brisby's God is a lot more concerned with power and authority than love and compassion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key difference that, you know, this depiction of God as the CEO that's just kind of demanding results and qualifications really stands apart from the traditional Christian view of God as this loving father.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how does he try to back this up?
Yeah.
Does he pull from Scripture to try to support these claims?
He does, in ways that might surprise you, though. So he uses verses, for example, from 1 Corinthians 6.23, where it talks about saints judging the world and even angels. And to him, this is like a divine job description.
Yeah, it's like, hey, look, here's what you could have, so you better start preparing for the promotion now.
Exactly.
It's like he's turning the Bible into a leadership training manual.
Yeah.
But if it's all about proving your competence to earn salvation, how does that explain evil? Or how does that explain the people who don't meet God's standards?
You know, that's where it gets really tricky.
Yeah.
Because Brisby doesn't really explicitly address the problem of evil or the role of free will. It's almost like he suggests God is like watching every move you make, like meticulously.
Okay.
Just looking for any signs that you might have leadership potential.
Right.
And are you going to obey his commands? And he even brings up the Peter principle.
Okay.
You know, the idea that people rise to their level of incompetence.
Right, right.
And he uses that to argue God's like a smarter manager. Like he doesn't promote people who aren't ready.
So God's got this perfect promotion system to avoid the dreaded incompetent leaders that we all have to deal with in the workplace.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
But even in the corporate world, we know that people make mistakes.
Yeah.
And even the best leaders can have setbacks.
Sure.
So does Brisby's God have any room for failure or for growth?
This is where I think his interpretation of the parable of the talents gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because for Brisby, this isn't just, hey, use your gifts wisely.
Right.
It's, you have to meet my demands, God's demands.
Oh, wow.
And you need to generate a return on his investment.
Okay.
The servant who buries his talent isn't just lazy to him.
Okay.
He's actually a thief. He's stealing from God because he's not maximizing his potential.
Hold on. Stealing from God, that's pretty intense.
Right.
I mean, that's definitely a far cry from how most Christians understand that parable.
Yeah.
You know, the focus there is often God's grace and forgiveness,
Yeah.
even when we fall short.
And it's very different from the traditional Christian idea that salvation is this free gift from God that we receive through faith in Jesus.
Right.
It's not something you earn by hitting some like divine performance metric.
Right. Yeah.
So Brisby is really giving us a much more transactional view of our relationship with God here.
It seems like it.
It's less about love and grace
Yeah.
and more about, hey, did you meet the quota? Did you hit the target?
Right. And he uses this phrase, little things matter, quite a bit.
Oh, okay.
Because to him, it's like every tiny thing you do is part of this ongoing job interview.
Gotcha.
You're always being watched. You're always being evaluated.
It's almost like Brisby is making God into like a micromanaging boss
Yeah.
who's more concerned with, like, did you comply than with, like, did you actually change?
Right.
Yeah.
And this brings up another point, another interesting point about Brisby's sermon, this idea of buy-in.
Okay.
He says, it's not enough to believe in God. You have to fully agree with God's program and philosophy.
Oh, wow. Even brings up King Saul's disobedience as this, like, cautionary tale,
Okay.
suggesting that anytime you question God's commands, that's rebellion. And that's going to have dire consequences.
All right, so here's where it gets really interesting, everybody. We're going to dive into this idea of buy-in and explore how Brisby uses the story of King Saul to really push this idea of absolute obedience to God.
Definitely.
Stay tuned for more.
Yeah, this is going to be good. So we're back, and we're still digging into this whole buy-in thing, this idea that you got to be completely obedient, no questions asked.
Which is like pretty different from how lots of Christians see faith.
Oh, totally. Like in traditional Christianity, doubting and trying to understand, even, respectfully disagreeing with some interpretations of the Bible, that's all part of it.
It's like wrestling with your faith, trying to grow. Right.
Exactly. It's about a real relationship with God, not just blindly doing whatever you're told.
But Brisby, he seems to think if you step outside his very specific interpretation of God's plan, you're basically rebelling.
And this is where he uses King Saul as an example. Saul disobeyed God's direct command to wipe out the Amalekites and everything they had. Brisby sees this as, like, the ultimate failure to buy in, which is why Saul lost his kingship.
So it's not just a mistake, it's like a loyalty test that he failed and that disqualified him in God's eyes. It's so weird how he brings in modern ideas, like it's almost a corporate thing.
It really is. That whole corporate analogy just runs through this entire sermon. God is the CEO, and you better follow his strategy, no questions asked.
It paints a pretty scary picture of God, right?
Yeah.
Like the only reason to obey is because you're scared of what'll happen if you don't.
Definitely. It's a world away from the traditional Christian idea of God as a loving father. Someone who wants a relationship built on love and trust and understanding.
Right, because that whole loving father thing, that's like central to Christianity, isn't it? It's not just some nice idea. It's all over the Bible.
Absolutely. The New Testament is full of stories that show God as compassionate, forgiving, like the prodigal son, where the father welcomes his son back no matter what he did. Or Jesus saying, God cares even for the sparrows. It's a completely different picture from this cold, calculating God Brisby's talking about.
And that changes how we think about salvation, too. For Brisby, it's like you got to earn it, prove yourself to CEO God. But traditional Christianity says it's a gift, given freely through faith in Jesus.
Huge difference. It's not about how good you are. It's about God's grace and accepting that gift through faith.
So even though Brisby talks about being godly, it's more like you got to be a good employee for God, not really about changing your heart.
Yeah, like he's turning faith into a set of rules, a checklist to get God's approval. But real faith goes way deeper than that.
It's about letting God's love change you from the inside out, not just doing the right thing.
It's a journey, not a finish line. And part of that journey is admitting your weaknesses, asking for forgiveness, and trying to understand and love God more.
You're not working your way into heaven. You're letting God's love change you.
Exactly.
So Brisby might have this powerful image of God as a CEO, but it really doesn't fit with what Christianity actually teaches. The God of the Bible isn't some micromanaging boss who's obsessed with numbers and results.
He's a loving father who wants a real relationship with us based on love and grace and forgiveness. And that's something worth remembering, especially when we hear teachings that twist God's character into something harsher, something scarier.
This has been a lot to think about, and we've only scratched the surface of this sermon, but we're running out of time for this part. Stay tuned, though, because we'll be back to talk about the bigger picture of what Brisby's saying and what can happen when fear and control take over instead of love and grace. Okay, so we're back, and I think it's pretty clear that Brisby's sermon is, well, it's definitely unique.
It is. And I think, we talked about how this corporate analogy just kind of takes over his whole interpretation of the Bible. Like, he sees these passages that are supposed to be about hope and forgiveness, and he turns them into warnings.
It's almost like he's reading the Bible through the lens of, like, a business deal.
Right. Like, God's constantly checking the numbers, not actually caring about changing people's hearts.
And that brings up a good point. When we look at anything, whether it's a sermon, a news article, whatever, are we letting our own biases affect how we understand it? Or are we actually open to other perspectives?
It's something we all got to deal with, right? Like, are we really seeing the message or just our own ideas?
Exactly. And I think that's what makes these deep dives so important. They make us think critically about everything we take in.
And Brisby's sermon, it's a good example of how religious teachings can get, like, twisted.
To fit someone's agenda or
Yeah.
support harmful power structures, yeah.
Exactly.
And it's almost ironic, like he's so worried about people disagreeing with God's corporation that he doesn't even consider that maybe he's the one misinterpreting things.
It happens a lot, unfortunately. When you get so focused on your own version of truth, you forget to look at the bigger picture, you know? And you can end up hurting yourself and other people with those rigid beliefs.
So how do we avoid that? How do we make sure we're not twisting things to fit our own story?
Well, I think it starts with humility. You got to realize you don't know everything, and what you think can change. And be open to other people's ideas, even if they challenge what you believe.
It's about asking questions, trying to understand, and being okay with maybe being wrong sometimes.
Exactly. And that's hard, especially with faith. But it's important if you want to grow and be truly compassionate and wise.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into John Brisby's sermon, what are some key takeaways? What can we learn from all this?
I think the biggest thing is to be critical. Don't just blindly believe everything you hear, even if it's coming from someone who seems like an authority.
Don't let your own experiences or biases change how you read the Bible either. Like we saw with Brisby, his corporate view really messed with how he understood God and salvation.
And at the end of the day, remember that real faith isn't about fear or trying to be perfect for God. It's about surrendering to his love.
It's about accepting God's grace and letting it work in you because he loves you for who you are, not what you do.
That's a message that gives everyone hope, no matter what they've done or how they feel.
So thanks for joining us as we explored this kind of strange world of religious beliefs. We hope this made you think critically about what you hear and to always try to understand more about faith, truth, and what life really means.